Hey everybody, it's good to be back. It's good to be back in town. Some of you may know, I sent a message to the class that I was in California that our daughter Emily had a baby, and the little boy, is fine. She just had a blood clot break loose and go to their head, and it was pretty ugly. And she had to go into the hospital, and so Jennifer and I had to take care of the baby while she was in the hospital. There's another side story to that, but it doesn't matter. The point was that we had to take care of the baby. And then I came home for like less than 24 hours, and another blood clot had broken loose, and she had to be rehospitalized. And my wife called 3 a.m. saying, "Could I please come back?" So I did. So that's why no class last week. I went back and came home yesterday with Jennifer. Everything's fine. They figured it all out. Emily will just have to put up with headaches from the breaking up pieces of the blood clot, the original one, for about a month. But I'm glad to say that the Lord was with us and took care of us. I'm glad I was free to go back out there and just be a stabilizing influence as we took care of the new little boy that's in our family. So thank you for that. Prayers. I know some people contacted me and said you'd be praying for me, and I appreciate that. Now, where we are in the story is we are in chapter 5, and we've been talking about the space where Jesus was asked to heal a little girl who was sick and dying by Jairus, the synagogue leader. And then it was interrupted. When we stopped, we just talked about the fact that another woman who had had bleeding for 12 years had touched Jesus, and she'd been healed, and he wanted to know who she was. And we talked all about that issue. And now where we are is we're back to Jesus dealing with the little girl who's sick, Jairus' daughter. So what I thought I would do, I'll pray, and then I'm going to read the parts of the story, take the pieces and put them together so that you get the whole thing of just the little girl's story. So let me pray, and then I'll tell you where we're going to start reading and where we're going to jump to, and then we'll get into this. Okay, Lord, I thank you that you are a God who is with us all the time, that your heart is tender towards us, that you know the details of our lives, and that you've given us your word so that we can see this and know this is real, that you are present and you care. I pray that part of your heart will really step out as I speak and teach this time today, because that's clearly what this passage is telling us. And make my words your words, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I'm going to start reading in verse 21 of chapter 5. And I'll read through verse 24, and then I'm going to skip over to verse 35 and finish the story. So here we go. This is to give us some context. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and lay your hands on her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. Now, skip over to verse 35, and it's going to say, while he was still speaking to her, and that's the woman who touched his garment that interrupts in this story. And goes, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, and they told him, "Your daughter is now dead. There is no use troubling the teacher now." Now, that's where we stopped last time, and then it says this, but Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." Actually, that's where we stopped the last time. And then it goes like this in verse 37. Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing, and he went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave. And he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha Koum, which means little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and totally amazed, and Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. So where we start now is where Jesus is not going to allow anybody to accompany him even to the house of Jairus at all, except Peter, James, and John. And what this means is that he stopped the crowd. There's this massive crowd that was around him from following him. And he held 9 of his disciples back as well. Now, this probably was an unusual moment. I can just see Jesus in some sort of authoritative way telling everybody to stay right here. Nobody come. He even stops 9 of his disciples. My thinking is that Mark's description of this event that is about to happen must have sounded good to John himself, the disciple who went with him, because he didn't include this story in his gospel. My thinking is that he'd seen what was written in Mark and Luke and Matthew. He'd seen this story retold, and he said, they've heard that enough. That's exactly how it happened. Because he was there too. He was an eyewitness. And these 3 men that accompanied Jesus, they are somewhat special from the other disciples. They are also going to be the same 3 that go to the Mount of Transfiguration. They must have had some kind of leadership, or they were tender in Jesus' heart or something. I don't know what it is, but what was happening in the moment, what is really important to remember is that what Jesus was doing by just taking these 3 men with him as he goes with the Father off to the Father's house is that he's turning this very, very public moment into a private moment, and for good reasons, which we'll get to soon. Now, it is interesting that the Greek here says something like this. It goes, Peter and James and John, the brother of James. It says it like that, and I'm thinking, that Peter wanted people to know that John, I know this is Tim's conjecture, but John was just James's brother. Not that he was a special guy or anything. He's just James's brother. And the reason I think is because Peter also had a brother. His name was Andrew, and Andrew never shows up as anything special. And I'm always thinking if Peter is the person who gave this to Mark, then he's always sort of downplaying John just a little bit in favor of his brother not getting any credit or anything. Now, I might just be making this up, but it just seems to me that Peter, to some degree, always is working so that John doesn't seem like he's all that special. He's just James's brother, but what do I know? It's just conjecture. But if you read the Mark, you see it all the time. John never gets much credit. Anyway, that's enough of that side story there. But how far they have to travel to get to Jairus' house is uncertain. But one thing is sure, that as they're going, they begin to hear the commotion that's at the house. So it had to be far enough away so that they couldn't hear this great wailing and the great sound until they get there. So it has to be far enough that the sound had not traveled to them. So it's a bit of a walk to the synagogue's leader's house. And when they get there, it is in an uproar. Actually, the word in the Greek there means a confused noise from a crowd. And it's the right word. In the NLT, they have the right kind of word in there too. It's the right word for what would have been happening. You see, the custom was that you had to make certain that any death, no matter whose it was somehow greeted, if you want to say a death is greeted, by wailing and great mourning. In fact, the rule was that even the poorest of persons, when they died, their death should at least be mourned, if you will, by at least 2 people, 2 wailers, and a trumpet player. I think it's a trumpet, but a horn, a blasting horn. And there were people who were actually pros at this. Their job was that they were professional mourners, and they were paid to come and make a whole lot of noise, to raise a ruckus. And this ruckus raising was a really important social moment. The louder the uproar, the more important the family of the deceased. And so we don't know how far away Jesus was, but they heard it eventually. They heard it, and Jairus, as we know, was an important local man. His family would have been devastated by the loss of their only 12-year-old daughter. The moment described in the Greek, it is great, that the uproar word. And interestingly, the verb there for what they're doing is in the masculine. So it makes it sound like men are doing this thing. Whenever I think about Middle Eastern deaths and I hear people wailing, it's always a sound from women that I hear in my head, but that the Greek, in the verb is in the masculine, that they're weeping and crying loudly. And it's a large crowd. It's the sound of a large crowd that's milling about in great confusion is a great definition that I read of this word. Now, Jesus comes on this expected mourning from Jairus' family. It would be normal, and his entrance into the mix of this doesn't win him any favors at all. Some scholars believe that what Jesus says was true. They say that the child was asleep. She was just in a deep coma. Thus, his first words are, "Why are you making such an uproar and weeping? The child did not die, but is asleep." Now, I'm just going to say, how would Jesus know that she was only sleeping? I mean, he hasn't even seen her yet. He hasn't been in the house. He doesn't know this little girl. Then again, one thing we can be sure of, and I've said it before in this class many times, ancient people knew when somebody was dead. Okay? They knew it. They could tell the difference between somebody who was dead and somebody who was alive. Even if they were in a deep coma, they could tell the difference. Now, they didn't start all this ruckus on the suspicion that she might be dead. No, they were not sure, but maybe we ought to make some noise just in case. No, it wasn't like that at all. Plus, we also know that this was a great crowd there, and there'd been plenty of people who would have gotten close enough to look and to test this, to see what was going on with this little girl. And Jesus entering this house and questioning the normal outpouring of grief, it would have sounded like somebody who was crazy. The NLT says they laughed at Jesus. The Greek is much meaner. It doesn't say they laughed. It says they ridiculed him. Ridiculed him. Now, some say that the quick shift from weeping and wailing to ridicule is a sign that these mourners were not so much interested in the family's loss as they were in performing some sort of professional duty. No, I'm not certain about that one way or the other, but I will say this. I have been present at a number of deaths. And I've been present after someone has died when they're still lying there newly gone for up to an hour or an hour and a half. And I'm just going to say that if somebody had busted into the room after an hour and said that they were certain that that person wasn't dead, but they were just sleeping, that would have been an odd moment. I'm just saying. But that's what's happening here. This is exactly what Mark tells his story in a very terse way. He's very quick and to the point because this is a hard thing that's going on right now. It says they ridiculed him. They ridiculed him. Of course they ridiculed him, but then it says, and he put them all out. Now, this too must have been a remarkable scene. Jesus has stopped a crowd and 9 of his disciples from coming with him, and now he throws a house full of mourners, professional and otherwise, out. I don't know what that must have looked like. I'm thinking that it must have been a very authoritative moment, and Jairus must have also said, come on, just go, just go. This is the teacher, just go. I don't know what happened, but I'm sure it was far more complicated than Mark tells us. And then Jesus does something, actually the Greek is very tender here. He takes the 3 disciples and he takes Jairus and his wife into the room where the child's body is, where it was laid out. I'm sure you know this, but the burial would have been as soon as possible. They didn't embalm, nothing like that. You died and they buried you quickly. So she's laid out, ready to be buried. And the Greek is, I said tender, and that's the way that I feel about it. It says, Jesus took the father of the child and the mother of the child, and then it says, and the ones with him. Suddenly, all of the emphasis moves to the parents, to mom and dad and their little girl. The disciples are onlookers. They're not even named anymore. They're just the ones with him. And what happened next is really important. It says Jesus took her by the hand. Now, touching a dead body was one of the most unclean things a person could do. Holy men avoided women at all costs, and a 12-year-old girl would have been considered a woman to them. And now she's a what? A dead woman. Holy men would have stayed as far away from this as possible. But Jesus takes her hand. He takes her hand. And he does more than lay his hands on her. He does more than Jairus requested. He holds her hand. And then he speaks to her. In Aramaic, Mark gives us the Aramaic. It's Talitha Koum. It means, little girl, stand up. Little girl, stand up. Now, the next thing that Mark does in the text is he tells us what this Aramaic phrase means. And it's important that he does. Remember, there is no way that his Roman audience is going to know what Aramaic means. They don't speak Aramaic. They don't know this language. Mark tells us what he says, and then he tells us that it means, little girl, get up. The reason is this, that he never wants to give the impression that Jesus had some magic words, that he was some kind of magician who had special words that you could say that would make the dead rise. Because he wanted to be certain that everyone knew that what was about to happen had no connection to magic, because everybody else in the world would have figured that this would have been what he's about. He's some sort of magician who has the special magic words. And if we use them in the proper way, we can raise the dead. And that was what the pagan world would have expected, that all miracles were the result of some sort of incantation. And Jesus wasn't doing any kind of incantation. He was speaking to a little girl whose hand he was holding. And he wants us to know he was just saying, get up, get up. Then Mark says this, and it goes immediately. He says, it says in the NLT, it says, and the girl who was 12 years old immediately stood up. This is another immediately. We've had tons of them. This is like the moment he says this, up she comes. And it says she rises. And the word that Mark uses is it's this wonderful word that is used throughout the New Testament by everybody who speaks of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. The word is anaste. It says she rose up. Now this is a hint of what? Of somebody else rising from the dead. It's the same language. She rises up. And he says, and it says the little girl, and this is also an interesting Greek word there. It is the diminutive form of the word kore. It's just the little girl. Most of the time, when that word is translated, it is translated the apple of my eye. That's the closest to the feeling of what the apple of his eye immediately rose up. Now, this one little sentence, it speaks both of the resurrection from the dead and the tenderness of Jesus. Mark then tells us that the little girl, whose age has not been given to us yet, it says she was old enough to walk, so we know she's not a baby. We haven't been told anything yet about her. She's not a baby because she can walk around. And then it says, Mark adds parenthetically, that she was 12 years old. And this information tells us even more about the tragic circumstances surrounding the death of this little girl and why Jesus wanted to keep this moment private. And we'll soon see how this all plays into Jesus telling the parents and the 3 disciples not to tell anybody about this. I've said this earlier, a 12-year-old girl would be the marrying age. She's ready to get married. My bet is she had a fiance, because if she was a rich, important man's daughter, they'd be ready to get her married at this age. And surely this event coming, the marriage, would have been the most important event in her young life, and her death would have touched 2 families directly, hers and her fiance's, and it would have turned up all kinds of questions about sin and punishment and all kinds of things that people would have wondered about. That world was all about everything having some connection to sin, and things that happen are all related. It's all mixed up together. Plus, if you think about it, if everybody would have known she was dead and she was raised from the dead, then it would have been a mark on her reputation forever. It would have deprived this little girl, I'm sure, of something that she was looking forward to, which was being both a wife and eventually a mother. Now, that was what was expected from women at the time. Wife, then mother, life is good. You've attained it. But if she is marked by the stamp of having been raised from the dead, she suddenly becomes a freak as opposed to a regular girl. And there's a way, I've got a lot more I could say about all this, but I think what's the most important thing to say was that it goes another immediate. It goes immediately they were exceedingly astonished with great astonishment. That's how the Greek reads, and I can only imagine. Her rising and walking clearly was from the dead. They weren't astonished because everybody had thought she was asleep and he'd waken her up out of a deep sleep. That's not why they were astonished. They weren't astonished by the possibility that everybody had made a big mistake and Jesus was the only one who could figure it out. That's not what they were astonished by. No, what they were astonished by was that Jesus was able to what? Awaken her from the dead. Simply by taking her hand and helping her up out of death. Now, verse 43 is an addition from Peter's memory. We don't get Jesus' actual words on this, but the Greek says, and he ordered them much. He ordered them much. And he must have been very direct with them. I'm sure that he was as equally authoritative as he spoke to them then as he was when he threw people out of the house and when he told people to stay back, all that. He's really serious. Nobody's supposed to know about this. He didn't want these events of the last few minutes broadcasted widely. What he wanted was for that gathering crowd to believe that they'd just mistaken what had happened and that he wanted them all to think, how did we miss that one? Because he didn't want them to talk about the fact that she'd been dead and he'd risen her from the dead. And I want to say that he did not want the word to spread in order to give her the possibility of a good life. Just as the first woman, he wanted the word to spread so she'd have the possibility of a good life. I'm just saying, she would have been questionable for the rest of her life if she'd one day been a corpse. That's as unclean as you could get. Who wants to marry her? Who wants to be her husband? And I'm just saying, he saved her a lot of trouble that this story didn't become what? Public until later when it starts to come out in the scriptures many years after. We don't know what happened to her, but we know Jairus' name is probably in there because he was still around to go ask him. And some people say, well, what's Jesus doing lying about this? Well, you know what? The word sleeping was then, and it still is, a way that people speak of those who have died. It's not unusual to say he's gone to his great rest, or he's sleeping in the arms of Jesus, or something like that. We say this all the time. People use that as a euphemism for dead. The dead, and the Jews did then. They thought that people went to sleep and awakened, and they awakened in the resurrection. And Jesus was knowing he knew he wasn't going to leave her in this state of sleep or death, and he chose to call her condition sleep to protect her, He wasn't lying, but he was using language that allowed him to fully give this girl life. Now, one other aspect of being alive in the ancient world was the general belief that the dead, particularly ghosts and phantoms, that sort of thing, did not eat. This is why Jesus told her parents to give her something to eat, to prove that she wasn't a ghost, to prove that she wasn't some sort of spirit, but she was alive. And you know what? This shows up again after Jesus comes back from the dead. He's always doing what? Eating with his disciples. He's not a ghost. He's a real person. Now this story, these two stories, it's a great picture of sandwiching stories. One story sandwiched into another. And the common overlaps are numerous. I'm going to end with this. Both of these stories are about women, people who had very little importance in the ancient world. Both of these stories are times about people who receive great tenderness from Jesus. Both women are near death. Both stories involve frightened, frantic people who bow before Jesus. Both stories involve crowds that would have very specific opinions about the women in these stories, and they weren't good opinions. Both stories revolve around the touch of Jesus. Both stories revolve around faith. Both stories involve great miracles. Both stories involve miracles that no one on earth other than Jesus could perform. Doctors could not help this one woman, and nobody could have raised the little girl from the dead. Both stories demand specific recognition of the saving of the person. Like one is, it's got to be public, and the other, it's got to be private. Both women are given life, and life in this context means that they can marry and have children now, which means life to ancient women. Neither story speaks of a public celebration of what Jesus had done. Nothing. I'm certain we can think of more commonalities between them or opposite things in them, but we also need to remember that these events didn't happen in a vacuum. This is all a part of one day. Think about this with me. One day it starts with teaching to a vast crowd, and then it's followed by a storm in a boat at night, and then a demonic man on a Gentile shore, and then the total rejection of the locals of Jesus back across the lake to a crowd that welcomes him in, and a request by a well-placed man to heal his daughter, and then the unexpected healing of a woman, followed by the raising from the dead of this little girl, and this is all one day. One day in Jesus' life, if that. Talk about an amazing day. And it's all given to us to tell us, who is this man? From these two events, we can see a number of new answers to the question. Jesus is a man who embodies the healing power of God, the ability to heal the brokenness of our bodies, especially the brokenness that no one else can cure. Jesus is also someone who has the power to raise the dead. This is something unimaginable by today's thinking. What exactly happened to that little girl, we don't know when she was dead, but I am confident that her experience of death was as tender as Jesus' treatment of her family in the moment. Whatever literally happened to her, Jesus had, and he still has, the power and the authority to reverse the hold of death over our lives. Jesus is also someone who knows our circumstances deeply enough to know how our power should work, how his power should work in our lives, how it should manifest itself in us so that he can give us life. This is an aspect of Jesus that is often missed in the synoptic gospels. They tend to show Jesus as being missional and on point, and the stories here show us a side of Jesus which John felt he had to give us in spades. He had to show us Jesus' tender heart and his attitude towards each one of us as individuals. But these two stories do it as well. This is why I believe John left this out of his gospel, because he'd read it in the others and said they did a great job there. And you know what? We're not done with talking about who is this man. Next week, we find out that the people that knew him the best didn't think he was anything special. We know, though, that Jesus is the man who can what? He can calm the wind and the waves. He's the man who has total control over the evil in the world. He's a man who can heal any disease and even raise the dead when the disease has taken a life. And all the while, this powerful, authoritative man cares enough for each one of us that he knows exactly what we need in the moment to give us life. He wants us all to live in peace. And he wants us all to know that our suffering will someday end, because he is that man. Oh, felt like I was preaching there, folks. I think this stuff preaches. Next week we move on to chapter 6. See you then. Thanks.